Today we will be looking at how the past perfect works with adverbs and subordinators. But before we start, let's do a quick review of the past perfect. Okay, let's look at the form of the past perfect. The past perfect uses the past form of the auxiliary verb have, so had, and it uses the past participle form of the verb eat, so eaten. So he had eaten the pie. Okay, now let's look at the meaning and usage of the past perfect. The past perfect is used for a past event that occurred before another past event. So if, as you can see on my verb tense timeline right here, we see that the first past event, the past perfect is the first event, and that there's another later event. Okay, let's look at the grammar of the later event and review the grammar of the later event. For the later event, you want to use the simple past. So she passed the test, simple past. And for the first event, we use the past perfect. So she had studied hard for the test. Okay, so she had studied hard for the test, so she passed the test. Okay, the first event uses a past perfect, had studied, and a second later event uses the simple past. Let's move on now and look at how the past perfect works with adverbs and subordinators. The subordinators before, until, and by are used to introduce the later past event, and therefore before, until, and by must be in a clause with the simple past. Okay, so for example, looking at before he passed the test, introducing the later event. He had studied hard, introducing the first event. Okay, so before he passed the test, he had studied hard. Okay, keep in mind that we use before to introduce the later event. Looking at until now, until she took the test, introducing the later event. She had been stressed, introducing the first event. Now looking at by. Okay, by the time he retired, introducing the later event. He had written 30 novels, introducing the first event. Okay, so keep in mind that we use before, until, and by to introduce the later past event, which must be a clause with the simple past. Moving forward now, let's look at when and while, the subordinators when and while. When and while also introduce the later past event, and these must also be in a clause with the simple past. So for example, when he started, the first event, the later event, okay, the first event, it had already been too late. Okay, let's look at while now. All right, while he left the house, the later event, the school bus had already passed the first event. Okay, let's move on now and look at how the past perfect works with already, just, recently, still, not, and not yet. Okay, we place yet, already, still, and just in the clause with the past perfect, and we do this to show how close the first action is to the later action. Today we're going to use today our later action is going to be Donna Tartt. Okay, Donna Tartt is a famous American novelist. She won Pulitzer for a novel called The Goldfinch. Let's talk a little bit about Donna Tartt now. By the time, so our later action, our later event. By the time Donna Tartt was 50, okay, we use already to discuss an action, to discuss when the first action has been accomplished before the later action. So by the time Donna Tartt was 50, she had already written 3 novels. Okay, here we can see that, Donna Tartt was 50. By then, she had already written 3 novels. Okay, she accomplished this before turning 50, or by that time. Moving on now, just recently is used in the first action to show that the first action was accomplished soon before the later action. We can see that right here. Here's a little X right here, and it was accomplished very near to the later action. Okay, so let's look at an example. She had just published The Goldfinch. Okay, so just a little bit before turning 50, Donna Tartt had published The Goldfinch. Okay, So this is soon before turning 50. Okay. Um, so, okay. Next, still and not are used for actions that have not been accomplished at the time of the later action. So, for example, she still had not won a prize. Okay. And lastly, not yet is used for unaccomplished actions at the time of, but possibly after later action. So these are actions that are not yet accomplished, but probably will be accomplished later, maybe after after the first action, after this later action. You can see right here, we have a little little circle with a line drawn through it, but it has an arrow pointing to a later possible accomplishment. And in case of Donna Tartt, this is true. By the time Donna Tartt was 50, she hadn't yet won a Pulitzer Prize. Okay, she won it later. I think about a year later, I think. So let's look at the narrative. By the time Donna Tartt was 50, she had already written 3 novels. She had just published The Goldfinch, and she still had not won a prize. And she hadn't yet won the Pulitzer. Okay, but she did later. Okay, let's do a quick summary of the past perfect. The subordinators before, when, while, until, and by introduced a later past event. By the time he retired, he had written 30 novels. We place yet, already, and just in the clause with the past perfect to show how close the first action is to the later action. Or the later action, by the time Donna Tartt was 50. Okay, we use already to discuss a first action is accomplished before the later action. She had already written 3 novels. Use just recently to describe that a first action that is accomplished soon before the later action. She had just published The Goldfinch. Use still and not for first actions that are unaccomplished at the time of the later action. She still had not won a prize. And used not yet for first actions that are unaccomplished at the time of, but possibly after the later action. So, and she hadn't yet won a Pulitzer Prize. This concludes this presentation. I hope that you enjoyed it. If you have any thoughts, questions, or concerns, please email me, and I look forward to seeing you in class.